Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming back to the Center for Presidential History, coming to the top of the hilltop. It's wonderful to see you all on this, our last event of the fall season. Thank you for your continued enthusiastic patronage and encouragement of presidential history. And please take a note of what we have coming up in the spring. I think you'll be equally pleased and enthused. I do also want to mention that we are entering, of course, the season of giving. And should you be so inclined, in particular, we are really highlighting, I've mentioned this before, our Dr. Aaron Crawford Memorial Fund. Dr. Crawford, Aaron, was one of our postdocs. Actually, he was our very first postdoc. Unfortunately, he succumbed to cancer this last year, and he was as pure a researcher as I've ever met in my entire life. And I actually can't tell you how many times over the course of the election I picked up my phone to text him to say, do you think this has ever happened before? Because he's the only one whose opinion I would really trust on this. And we have created a fund to help graduate students do their research and to go to archives. So if you're interested in supporting the work of our graduate students this fall and this winter, please keep that in mind, if you would. Now, to move to a happier note, if you will, tonight is a real great pleasure of mine. One of the great pleasures of my job is to be able to bring back friends who have published books. In fact, Jean Becker and I are such good friends in some way, though we hadn't actually seen each other physically for a while, because we've known each other for 20 years, which is why the first thing that Jean said to me when I saw her this afternoon was, wow, you've gone gray. So here's the thing, she's not wrong. Jean has been a wonderful colleague and contact for me for 20 years now, and so it's a great pleasure to have her back here. I'm going to give a very brief bio for her, although I'm sure you've already looked, and then in particular encourage you to make sure that you pick up a copy of this wonderful book, whose title seems particularly appropriate. Maybe. Who knows? Jean Becker was the chief of staff for President George H.W. Bush from March 1, 1994, until his death, November 30th of 2018. She had previously served as deputy press secretary to First Lady Barbara Bush during the Bush years from 89 to 92. After the 92 election, she moved to Houston in order to help Mrs. Bush with the editing of her autobiography, which was Barbara Bush, a memoir. She later assisted Mrs. Bush with a follow-up book, Reflections, which was published in 2003. Before joining the White House staff in 1989, Jean was a reporter in Washington, D.C., primarily for USA Today, where her duties included covering the 1988 presidential election. She is a very proud graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism. Is that right? Okay, good. You looked at me suspiciously, as a journalist would, so that's good. And spent time with USA Today. She is the editor of Pearls of Wisdom by Barbara Bush, and also of two books of her own recently, the New York Times bestseller, The Man I Knew, The Amazing Story of George H.W. Bush's Post-Presidency, and now this book, Character Matters, and Other Life Lessons from George H.W. Bush, which was just published in April of this year. It is a great, great pleasure to have Jean come here to tell us about a president who I think was quite significant for all of us. So, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight, particularly post-pandemic. Whenever anybody shows up for anything, I'm just grateful. Are you live streaming this?
No.
See, that helps. Otherwise, they could be home in their pajamas watching this. I am going to speak from notes. I learned the hard way early in my book tour that if I just start talking, I would go off topic. And my big fear tonight, if I don't speak from notes, I may talk about the football game last night. Okay, never mind. Okay, that was really bitchy for me to bring that up. Okay. Anyway, Jeff, the first picture I want to show you, Jeff used to be We became great friends because he was a professor at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M, and I've never really forgiven him for leaving. So who let President Bush wear tennis shoes to that talk? Anyway, there's Jeff before he went gray. And I asked the library, the Bush Library, to send me a bunch of photos of Jeff and President Bush, and this was my favorite, mainly because it says the Bush School, Texas A&M University. I want to steal you back, but he assures me he's very, very happy here. But he and President Bush were very good friends. They were very, very close, and those are the worst shoes. I should have noticed that before I picked that photo. Anyway, let me just start by saying being President Bush's chief of staff for nearly 25 years was a wild and crazy roller coaster ride. It was crazy. And after he died, I wasn't really sure that I should write a book. So I sought the advice and permission from the 5 Bush children. I feel sort of funny calling them children. And the very first of their children, of his children, to answer me would be George W. Bush. And he was very supportive, and he said, would love for you to write a book about Dad. So I spent the pandemic actually writing this book, The Man I Knew. Is what got me through the pandemic. Now you might wonder why working for a former president, some might say an unemployed president, was such a wild ride. As I say in the book, the 5 scariest words, there's a whole chapter in this book devoted to this topic. The 5 scariest words the man ever said to me was, "Jean, I have an idea." Sometimes it would be something as simple, do you want to get pizza for lunch? And I'd be like, oh, thank God. And then other times, I still remember the day he sat in my office at 7 a.m. and told me he wanted to start jumping out of airplanes. My first question to him was, have you told your wife? And his answer was, no. During cocktails tonight, I'm going to tell her. He jumped, I think, he was shot down during, I did something stupid. That's a miracle, I fixed it myself. President Bush was shot down during World War II, September 2nd, 1944, over Chichijima, bombing a radio tower. His 2 crewmates were killed. He was able to parachute out, got rescued, and I think he would laugh to hear me say this, but I know I'm right. He needed a do-over. The only time he had parachuted was when he was being shot at. So he started parachuting. He's about 75 years old, and his last parachute was on his 90th birthday. His wife was opposed to it. He parachuted in Kennebunkport into the yard of the church they attended, to which Barbara Bush said, well, if it doesn't go well, we'll just carry you inside and have the funeral. Then there were times I really didn't know what he was thinking. He is wearing an aardvark hat here, and I know some of you may have to Google what the heck's an aardvark. I had to. I'm actually trying to have a serious conversation with him here, and he wore this hat for an entire day, and I think his purpose in life was to bug me, quite frankly. And it's very hard to have a serious conversation with someone wearing a hat like that. Anyway, my life was never boring. As I said in the book, Mikhail Gorbachev once told me to shut up, and I'm oddly proud of that. And Tom Selleck once kissed me. You know, when I tell this to college students or high school students, they're like, thank you, you all got that. As I wrote the book, I realized there was something much more important pouring out of my heart and soul about George Bush. He really did leave us a blueprint on how to live a life well lived. He lived what he preached, that any definition of a successful life must include serving others. And perhaps there is no better example of his servant's heart than his extraordinary friendship with Bill Clinton. There's an entire chapter in The Man I Knew dedicated to the odd couple, That's what Mrs. Bush called them. Mrs. Bush was convinced that her husband was the father Bill Clinton never had. And I do think she's right. They had very much of a father-son relationship. And their matchmaker was actually the 43rd President of the United States. While we were all having dinner on Christmas Day 2004, a horrific tsunami hit South Asia. It's considered one of the worst disasters in world history. I think 25,000 people died. It hit Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, the Maldives. And the President of the United States called his dad and said, all the nonprofits, Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, AmeriCares, they're all racing to the region, but they needed millions of dollars. This was a horrific tragedy. And he wanted his dad and Bill Clinton, because he wanted to be totally nonpartisan or bipartisan, to raise money for the nonprofits. And they both said yes. And that was the beginning of this extraordinary friendship. He then sent them to South Asia in February to represent him, to visit with the head of states, to visit the region, to come back and give them a report. And I went with them, and I will tell you that they left on that trip as colleagues with a common purpose, and they came home best friends. And I'll tell you how it happened. President Bush had not been diagnosed with Parkinson's yet, but we knew there was something going on with him. He was such a great athlete, but he was very unsteady on his feet. He had a hard time going up and down stairs or even getting out of a chair. We just weren't sure. He had not been diagnosed yet, but I was really worried, and Mrs. Bush was very worried about him taking this trip. So on the plane going over, President Bush was sound asleep. I never met President Clinton, and I told him of my concerns, and I asked him to look after him because it would be the two of them with the head of state. It would be the two of them in the photo, not me, not his, the staff had to stay on the sidelines. And I will tell you that President Clinton took it to heart. He was so protective of him and did it in such a way that I know President Bush never caught on. He just very discreetly would wait for him, and it was wonderful. The other side of this is George Bush was never late for anything in his life. Bill Clinton has never been on time for anything in his life, ever. And I think this really began, we're in Sri Lanka, and the prime minister had like a state dinner for the two of them. This woman's country had been destroyed. And President Bush felt strongly that right after dinner, they should leave and either let her go back to work or maybe get some sleep. But President Clinton is, working the crowd, talking, and his staff wouldn't pull him out. I went to his chief of staff and said, President Bush thinks they need to go. And she said, oh, no, we don't ever pull him. So I told President Bush, and he said, I got this. So he went up to President Clinton, poked him on the shoulder, and said, Bill, it's time to go. Get in the car. And President Clinton said, yes, sir. And the whole rest of the trip was like that. One time he said to President Clinton, Bill, you're talking too much. Let these people talk. Yes, sir. And one morning, we're in Thailand. President Clinton's a little late. He kept getting better. President Bush is in the car waiting for him. He's reading a book. I'm on the porch of the hotel thinking, when do I call President Clinton's room? And he comes out on the front porch, and he sees President Bush in the car. And he didn't see me. He said under his breath, oh, shit, I'm in so much trouble. And you know what? They became best friends, and they got into the disaster business. They raised, I think, $150 million alone for Hurricane Katrina. And this picture, that's in Galveston. This is after Hurricane Ike. Ike was, I can't remember, I think it was 2007. George W. was still president. They'd already done Katrina. They'd done some other disaster. When Ike came ashore in Galveston, President Bush called President Clinton and said, Bill, we need to go to work. And he said, I'm ready. And then President Bush called his son. And I heard he said, George, go out and announce the Bush-Clinton-Ike Fund. We got this. And I could hear the president say, okay, Dad. But there they are. Many of you will recognize Secretary James Baker is standing on the other side of President Bush. And then there's Hurricane Harvey, which dumped 50 inches of rain on Houston in 48 hours in 2017. And when Harvey happened, the two Bush presidents were going to tackle Harvey because it's Texas and it's Houston, one of their homes, and it's just like it had been Dallas. 41 would have said to 43, I'm here with you. So President Bush said, tell President Clinton's chief of staff and tell the others, the Bush boys have got this. So I emailed all the chief of staffs, and actually President Obama's chief of staff called me and said he would like to help. I mean, it was just Harvey, as you remember, was just Houston was underwater. All the former presidents wanted to help. And so then we were having a fundraiser at A&M. We already had a little event planned on a Saturday night. Larry Gatlin and the Gatlin brothers were coming. We're gonna have a barbecue under a tent, just the two Bush presidents. And again, I get a call from President Obama's chief of staff and said, I told them as an FYI. And she said, you know what, he's free that Saturday night and he can bring Lady Gaga. We moved from the tent to Reed Arena, where the Aggies play basketball. And I think they raised $43 million that night alone. And this is a picture of all the former presidents came. I want you to ignore the woman in the back of this photo. I do not know who she is. It is really embarrassing that she photobombed the presidents, so ignore her completely. I showed this picture last week in Cincinnati, and I was wearing the same clothes. It's hard to claim that's not me when, I love showing this photo. One funny story. When I told the Bushes, so President Clinton's chief of staff called me. President Clinton was supposed to be in Germany this night. And she said, is it true that Barack Obama's coming? And I said, yes. And she said, if you think President Clinton's going to let Obama come to Texas to hang out with the Bush boys without him, you're crazy. So then I called President Carter's chief of staff as a courtesy, and she said, oh my God, he'll want to come. And so this is all 5 former presidents backstage at Reed Arena waiting to be called out. Oh, let me back up. When I told the Bushes that all 4 of the other 3 former presidents were coming, President Bush cried. He was so touched. Mrs. Bush asked me if she had to give them dinner. I mean, it really doesn't matter where you are in life. It's sort of the same things you worry about. And I said, yes, you do have to give them dinner. And for the record, she didn't have to cook it either. What I love about this photo is this is how it's supposed to be. This is how it's supposed to be. We need to get back to this. And what I love is the camaraderie. They're actually, you can tell they're having a good time, that they're enjoying each other. The other thing about this photo that I love is President Bush used to get asked once in a while by some of his more conservative friends, why on earth are you friends with Bill Clinton? And he would always say the same thing, I'm old. I have run out of things to say. And when I'm with Bill, I don't have to worry about it because he does all the talking. Look who's doing the talking in this photo. There's 5 presidents there, and he's holding court, and he's obviously telling a story that they all are, it seemed to be enjoying it very, very much. But I do love what this photo says. This is where we need to get back to this kind of bipartisan, nonpartisan, working together. I mean, President Bush and President Clinton raised hundreds of millions of dollars for disaster relief in this country. Believe it or not, this is not my favorite disaster story. Now, people in Houston, do you all know about Hurricane Rita? You may be too far north. What a lot of people don't know, no one outside of Texas knows this, about a week after Hurricane Katrina, Another hurricane came ashore west of New Orleans, and it was Hurricane Rita, and it pretty well chewed up the rest of the Louisiana coastline and a little bit of the Texas coastline around Beaumont. And nobody connected with Rita could get any help. Everybody's in New Orleans. All the nonprofits, the media, the celebrities, the volunteers. Rita was sort of falling through the cracks because Katrina was such a huge disaster. So a man called our office. His name was Richard Schluschlag, and he was from Cameron, Louisiana, which is a town right on the Gulf Coast in Louisiana. It's President Bush had a relationship with Cameron, which he knew. When President Bush was in the offshore oil business, all of his oil rigs were off the coast from Cameron. If he wanted to go visit his oil rigs, it's Cameron where he went to then go out to the oil rigs. Their hospital had been leveled. Cameron had been leveled, except for a couple of buildings, but the hospital had been leveled. And Richard said, could President Bush help us build an emergency room? We have no health care here. And if we could just get help building the emergency room, people will start coming back, but we need health care, and then we'll take care of the rest of the hospital. So President Bush said, of course he would help. And the week before Christmas, we're going to Cameron with a $3 million check. Actually, we already sent them the money. We were going to have one of those big fake checks. And they were going to break ground for the new emergency room. And the governor was coming, and the high school marching band was going to play. And I'm showing President Bush the schedule. He said, Jean, this is really boring. This is a boring event. And I sort of looked at him, possibly with attitude. I personally think a former president coming to town with $3 million the week before Christmas is not boring. He said, we need to do something special for them. They've had a tough year. I have an idea. He says, Barr and I have fallen in love with this TV show. We watch it every night. It's called ER. We just love it. And there's a young actor on it. I think his name is George Clooney. And I think he's the star of the show. Let's invite George Clooney to go to Cameron with us. He said, do you get it, Jean? ER? ER. It's perfect. Well, here's what he didn't get. They're watching it in reruns on TBS. ER is no longer on TV, network TV. George Clooney is now making all those ocean movies. He's he's People Magazine's Sexiest Man of the Year. He's a superstar. And I said to President Bush, I said, sir, ER is not even on TV anymore. And he looked at me and said, every night. He's one of the smartest men I ever knew and will ever know, but you explain reruns to a former president. It's just not in their psyche. So I said, you know what, sir? George Clooney's not coming. It's a week before Christmas. We don't know him. He's not in my Rolodex. I had a great Rolodex, but George Clooney was not in my Rolodex. I said, we don't know anyone who knows him. George Clooney is not coming to Cameron, Louisiana with you the week before Christmas. I had the best job in America. That would be George Clooney and George Bush in Cameron, Louisiana. He came, and here President Bush could Google with the best of them. He Googled George Clooney, found out I was right about some things. What I didn't know, probably the only Republican in Hollywood, a good friend of President Bush's named Jerry Weintraub, who was the producer of all the ocean movies. And President Bush came into my office and said, you didn't tell me Jerry Weintraub was the producer of all the ocean movies. And I said, I had no idea. He says, I'm calling Weintraub. Weintraub said, let me call him. And he came. And on the way home, did I go with them? Yes. There is no picture of me and George Clooney. I know that, but I do have a story. There's no press here, is there? No. Okay. On the way home, everyone fell asleep but the two of us. And I asked him why he came. I said, why did you do this? You don't know us, him, why? He said it was because, he said if it was to go to New Orleans for Katrina, I would have said no. Brad Pitt's been wanting me to come for months. He was so touched that President Bush was raising money for a town that no one had heard of, that had been destroyed by a hurricane that no one had heard of. And he said, it just touched my heart that what he was trying to do. And when Weintraub called me, I looked at my schedule and I said, I'll go. We had to find a plane to bring him from somewhere in California. Was it hard to find someone to fly George Clooney? No. But here's my story. I did not put this in any of the books. It's not appropriate, but I feel very close to you all. On the plane coming home, I had to go powder my nose. And when I came out of the bathroom, it's a small plane. Clooney is in the galley of the plane, and he's waiting to go into the bathroom. And we had to do this to get by each other. Okay, I'm way off topic. What I loved about working for President Bush is even this extraordinary whatever you call it, incident, event, there was something to be learned. And one of his favorite quotes came from hockey great Wayne Gretzky, who once said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. President Bush quoted him all the time. And this is a great example of that. You know, what do we have to lose? Let's try to find Clooney and invite him. And if he says no, so what? He said yes. So I'd like to circle back to where I began. So the lesson I learned is don't be afraid to think big. So talking about President Bush leaving us a blueprint on how to live a life well lived, I would love to say that this book was my idea, but it wasn't. It was my editor's idea. And we were having lunch in New York a couple years ago, and I had a couple of book ideas for him. The man I knew was on the bestseller list. They wanted me to do another book. I had some great ideas. My editor's name is Sean, and he said, I want you to write one more book about George Bush. And I looked at him rather oddly, and I said, you do remember he died at the end of the last book. I said, I've got nothing. But his idea was, and he talked about the relationship with President Clinton. I think he even talked about the Clooney story. He says, I just feel like there's so much we can learn from him. I just feel like there's so many life lessons we can learn from him. So out of that lunch came this book. And what I did is I emailed the people who knew him best, everybody from his head of state peers to family, former staff, friends, and my inbox just started filling up with stories. And there's essays from former Prime Minister of the UK, Jon Meacham, Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who wrote something for me before he died, Andy Card, Condi Rice, Bob Gates, Secretary Baker wrote the foreword, Dan Quayle wrote the epilogue. But there's also essays from Reba McEntire and Dana Carvey, and the young man who mowed the yard at Walker's Point, who now is 43's personal aide. So it pretty well covers his entire people from all walks of life. The stories are just amazing. And so what I would love to do is read a few excerpts from the book. How long do I get to talk? Oh, as long as I want? They may have plans. No? I'm just going to read you some excerpts from the book. There is one chapter in the book that are all his words. I put in the book some of his speeches, some of the letters he wrote, some of his diary entries, some essays. This is the address he gave to the nation. Do you remember, most of you are old enough to know who Rodney King was? Rodney King was a black man who was beat up by white cops in LA. It was really the very first, very public incident of a black man being beat up by white cops. And the president LA broke out into huge riots after those white police officers were found not guilty. And the president addressed the nation from the Oval Office, and this is what he said. If we are to remain the most vibrant and hopeful nation on earth, we must allow our diversity to bring us together, not drive us apart. This must be the rallying cry of good and decent people. We must build a future where in every city across this country, empty rage gives way to hope, where poverty and despair give way to opportunity. After peace is restored to Los Angeles, we must then turn again to the underlying issues of such tragic events. We must keep on working to create a climate of understanding and tolerance, a climate that refuses to accept racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, and hate of any kind, anytime, anywhere. Tonight, I ask all Americans to lend their hearts, their voices, and their prayers to the healing of hatred. When I found this, my reaction was, we need his voice more than ever. The following is the essay that Joe Strauss wrote for this book. Joe Strauss was Speaker of the House here in Texas for a number of years, lives in San Antonio. Standing on what he called the front porch of democracy to give his inaugural address on January 20th, 1989, President Bush said, "I take as my guide the hope of a saint. In crucial things, unity. In important things, diversity. In all things, generosity." Then we're back to Joe Strauss's voice now. In a present era when partisanship has risen and tribalism has spread, there is great impact in those three basic ideas: unity, diversity, and generosity. Too often, the way to get ahead in politics is by appealing to someone's worst instincts rather than their better angels. We have been conditioned to think that the path to power is through dividing and conquering. In contrast, President Bush built bipartisan coalitions around lasting achievements, from the passage of Americans with Disabilities to Operation Desert Storm. I can think of no better remedy in the tribalism in our politics today than the words President Bush spoke and the approach he embodied. He knew how to tap into our common goodness rather than trying to exploit our differences. Every day, people go to extraordinary lengths to extend a hand of help or compassion, whether in their vocation or in their spare time. Why should our politics be so different? We can be competitive without being caustic. The principles that President Bush promoted in his inaugural address and in so much of his life in and out of office are bigger than any one political party or ideology. Decency and goodness transcend any construct of conservative versus liberal or red versus blue. I love that Joe Strauss, just wonderful words of advice for all of Americans. This would be his funeral at the National Cathedral. It'll be 6 years, November 30th, since he died. This is at the National Cathedral, all the presidents, first ladies. I was in charge of the funeral, and I really should do an entire book on presidential funerals. Oh my God, if I don't go to heaven, none of you will. There's a lot of stories to tell. I would love to read part of Jon Meacham's eulogy. Jon Meacham wrote the definitive biography of President Bush, not as good as any of your books. Your books are much better. John wrote the book, Destiny and Power, and as I mentioned earlier, President Bush was shot down during World War II, and he really spent his whole life dealing with the fact that his two crew members died, and he had what I think is classically called survivor's guilt, and there's a lot of that in both of these books. Anyway, this is what John wrote, what he said in his eulogy. Through the decades, President Bush would ask himself, why me? Why was I spared? In a sense, the rest of his life was a perennial effort to prove himself worthy of his salvation on that distant morning. To him, his life was no longer wholly his own. There were always more missions to undertake, more lives to touch, more love to give. And what a headlong race he made of it all. He never slowed down. On the primary campaign trail, he once shook the hand of a department store mannequin in New Hampshire, asking the mannequin for his vote. When he realized his mistake, he said, "Never know, gotta ask." You can hear that voice, can't you? As Dana Carvey said, the key to a Bush 41 impression was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. George Herbert Walker Bush was America's last great soldier statesman, a 20th century founding father. He governed with virtues that most closely resemble those of Washington and of Adams, of TR and FDR, of Truman and of Eisenhower, of men who believed in causes larger than himself. And because life gave him much, he gave back. He stood in the breach in the Cold War against totalitarianism. He stood in the breach in Washington against unthinking partisanship. He stood in the breach against tyranny and discrimination. And on his watch, a wall fell in Berlin, a dictator's aggression did not stand, and doors across America opened to those with disabilities. And he stood in the breach against heartbreak and hurt, always offering an outstretched hand, a warm word, a sympathetic tear. If your heart were troubled, he would rush to mend it. If your heart were soaring, he would make haste to celebrate your success. It was and is the most American of creeds. Abraham Lincoln's Better Angels of Our Nature, and George H.W. Bush's Thousands Points of Light. They are companion verses in America's national hymn. For Lincoln and Bush both called on us to choose the right over the convenient, to hope rather than to fear, to heed not our worst impulses, but our best instincts. That was the real George H.W. Bush, a loving man with a big, vibrant, all-enveloping heart. If I have trouble finishing this, you got to come up and help me. Okay, I can do it. And so, as we commend his soul to God, we ask, as he often did, why him? Why was he spared? The workings of providence are mysterious, but this much is clear. The George Herbert Walker Bush, who survived that fiery fall into the waters of the Pacific, made our lives and the lives of nations freer, better, warmer, nobler. That was his mission. That was his heartbeat. And if we listen closely enough, we can hear the heartbeat even now, for it's the heartbeat of a lion who not only led us, but who loved us. That's why him. That's why he was spared. I didn't cry. I get asked a lot these days, before and after the election, what I think President Bush would say if he were here now. And that's not a fair question, because he died 6 years ago, and I don't want to put words in his mouth. His oldest son has encouraged me not to put words in his mouth. But I do want to share with you one story. I think I know what he would say if he were here. Right after 9/11, he and Mrs. Bush were hosting some people at their house for cocktails. And particularly, there was a number of young families there, and there were a couple of mothers who were really upset. And everyone was upset about 9/11. I mean, our world turned upside down on 9/11. But one mother in particular, another one, kept going on, I don't know why, went too close, kept saying, "You have no idea, Mr. President, how hard it is to be a parent now. You have no idea what we're going through. You've never had to go through anything like this." I watched him count to 10. And then he said, with great patience, like a father or a grandfather, he talked about the Depression. He talked at length about World War II, how the whole world was at war. He talked at length about, he talked about the Cold War. He talked at length about the 1960s. I was in the second grade when JFK was shot here in Dallas. It's one of my earliest memories in my life. And you all, a lot of you in this room, admit it, remember the 60s. They were horrible. JFK was shot, Bobby Kennedy was shot, Martin Luther King was shot. It seemed like every time we woke up, there was another assassination. The Vietnam War was tearing this country apart. The LBJ was leading the way on civil rights, but it could get ugly and complicated. And President Bush said, the 60s, that's when I raised my kids. And his point to them, I love what he said at the end. He said, the only reason I'm not bringing up the Civil War, I wasn't alive then. But he told these young people, he says, all of this happened just in my lifetime. And he did say this. I quoted him saying this last night. Everyone's like, he didn't say this. Yes, he did. He said, pull up your big boy pants and your big girl pants. He says, life is complicated. And this is not going to be the last crisis that this country will face in your lifetime. But we will get past this. We will survive this. And for those of you who are upset about the election and those of you who are happy about the election, but if you're upset about the election, and I have a lot of friends, I have one friend who I still don't think has gotten out of bed since Election Day. I've been quoting President Bush a lot on this. You know, democracies are complicated, and we will get past this. So I would love to read to you what he said to the nation after he lost to Bill Clinton. Back in the day, the President of the United States did a radio address every Saturday. I don't think they do that anymore. Now it's all about social media. But this is what he said to the nation on November 7th, 1992, the Saturday after he lost to Bill Clinton. Way back in 1945, Winston Churchill was defeated at the polls. He said, I've been given the Order of the Boot. That is the exact same position in which I find myself today. I admit this is not the position I would have preferred, but it is a judgment that I honor. Having known the sweet taste of popular favor, I can more readily accept the sour taste of defeat because it is seasoned for me by my deep devotion to the political system under which this nation has thrived for 2 centuries. Ours is a nation that has shed the blood of war and cried the tears of depression. We have stretched the limits of human imagination and seen the technologically miraculous become almost mundane. Always, always, our advantage has been our spirit, a constant confidence, a sense that in America, the only things not yet accomplished are the things that have not yet been tried. President-elect Clinton needs all Americans to unite behind him so he can move our nation forward. But more than that, he will need to draw on this unique American spirit. There are no magic solutions to our problems. The real answers lie within us. We need more than a philosophy of entitlement. We need to all pitch in, lend a hand, and do our part to help forge a brighter future for this country. On January 20th, Barbara and I will head back to Texas. For us, there will be no more elections, no more politics. Yeah, right. Ask the guy whose library is over there. But we will rededicate ourselves to serving others because, after all, that is the secret of this unique American spirit. With this spirit, we can realize the golden opportunities before us and make sure that our new day, like every American day, is filled with hope and promise. That was his message to the country after he lost the election. Now, I was going to end with that, but I think you cannot really talk about George Herbert Walker Bush, I know, without talking about them. This is their 70th wedding anniversary. They were married 73 years by the time she died. She died in April. He died in November. This is how smart George Bush was. One of my favorite stories, essays in the book, was written by one of Mrs. Bush's aides who was helping work the phones at the front desk at the office one day. And the phone rings, and it's General Colin Powell. And before she could put him through to President Bush, the next line rings, and it's the governor of Texas, George W. Bush. And then the third line rings, and it's James A. Baker III. And Kara's like, oh my God. So she's about ready to run into his office and say, you have Colin Powell, James Baker, your son, the governor. When the fourth line rings, we only had 4 lines, and it was Barbara Bush. So she runs into President Bush's office, says, sir, the following people are on hold for you, Colin Powell, James Baker, the governor, and your wife. And without hesitating, he said, put my wife through and tell the others I'll call him back. He was a smart man. I hope all the husbands here were paying attention to that story. So I usually end there, but you know, these times are sort of complicated. So I'm going to end by quoting her. This is from a speech she wrote that she gave, I don't think it was right after 9/11. And since the election, I've resurrected this speech. So I'm going to end with something I think she would say if she were here. A couple of years ago, she was talking about when her passion was literacy, as most of you know, and she would get frustrated because there were still millions of Americans who couldn't read or write, and she was talking to a group of people about the importance of volunteerism, but how hard it can be. And this is what she said to them. A couple of years ago, when I was having one of those days, I decided to work in my garden in Maine. The instructions that came with the peonies I wanted to plant were very clear. Dig a deep bed, mulch, fertilize plant flowers just so, and give plenty of water. They went on to say that if you followed the instructions exactly, the plants will not bloom the first year, but they will bloom the next year and every year thereafter for 100 years. I remember thinking to myself, I'm really planting these peonies for my children and grandchildren and their children. Volunteer work is a lot like planting peonies. You may not see the results right away, but you are planting seeds that one day will sprout and bloom forever. My advice is never to give up, to persevere. A missionary was sitting in a small corner restaurant reading a letter delivered from home. As she opened the letter, a crisp new $20 bill caught her attention. Needless to say, she was pleasantly surprised, but as she read the letter, her eyes were distracted by a movement of a raggedly dressed man on the sidewalk leaning against a light post. She couldn't get him and his condition out of her mind. Thinking that he might have a greater financial need, she slipped the bill into an envelope on which she quickly wrote, "Persevere." Leaving the restaurant, she nonchalantly dropped the envelope at the stranger's feet. Turning slowly, he picked it up, read it, watched the woman walk away, and smiled as he tipped his hat at her. The next day, walking down the street, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She found the same shabbily dressed man smiling as he handed her a roll of bills. When she asked what they were for, he replied, "That's the money you won, lady. Persevere paid 5 to 1. Now, I cannot promise you riches if you persevere, but I do encourage you to never give up on yourself or your dreams. That's what we're going to end. As soon as I told the George Clooney story, I start getting hot. Okay, I'm happy to take questions. Do you have any questions?
Okay, as we like to do, if you wouldn't mind, please wait for the microphone. Raise your hand if you have a question. Our postdocs will bring you one. There's one down here, very enthusiastic. And that's too young.
Hi. We were told by the press that Trump nominated the first female chief of staff. So that's an error, correct?
No, she will be the first White House chief of staff.
Oh, White House. You were
I
chief
was
of
only
staff.
President Bush's chief of staff post-White House.
Got it.
There's never been a White House chief of staff.
Thank you.
Anybody else? You're being very shy. Yes?
Thank you so much. My question is if you could share a time when you were surprised by President Bush's reaction to something.
When I was surprised by his reaction, no, I can't think of any time. We had a couple of huge fights, and I'm not sure that counts. I'll tell you one of the biggest fights we had. I'll tell you both of them. One's funny and one, I was so bad at him. He was throwing Mrs. Bush a 75th surprise birthday party. And I looked at the guest list, and everyone on the guest list were his friends, his former White House staff. And, of course, they had a lot of mutual friends, but none of her friends. She had a lot of these great girlfriends in Houston, and none of her East Wing staff was on the list. It was all his staff. And I said, sir, this is not you. You need to invite her people. And I got so mad at him, I left and went home for the day, and we got over it. He saw my point. But the maddest he ever got at me, are there any baseball fans here? I'm a huge St. Louis Cardinal fan. And President Bush went to his grave disappointed that he did not turn me into an Astros fan. I was a devoted, I grew up in Missouri. I grew up on the St. Louis Cardinals. And I'm at the ball game with him in Houston. The Astros are playing the Cardinals. And Albert Pujols hit a huge home run. And I had just read somewhere that if Albert Pujols stayed healthy, that he could end his career as the best hitter in baseball. And I told President Bush that. Well, Ted Williams was one of his best friends. He never got over it. And the next day, Secretary James A. Baker III, the man who negotiated the end of the Cold War, called me and said, did you really tell him that Pujols was a better hitter than Ted Williams? He told you this? Yes, he's very upset. He called and told me. And for months I would run into people who would say, you told George Bush that Albert Pujols, I'm oh, good God. So fast forward to President Bush's funeral. President Bush was very good friends with Tony La Russa, who was the Cardinals manager for a number of years. He had known Tony La Russa. He used to manage the Oakland A's, who won the World Series when President Bush was president. They became great friends, blah, blah. Well, Tony was invited to President Bush's funeral, and he emailed me and said that his wife couldn't come. Could he bring someone else? Because the invitation was a +1. I said, of course. And emailed and said, great, I'm bringing Albert Pujols. I thought it was sort of funny, honestly. Well, they went to the funeral at the cathedral. And somehow, Tony and Albert managed to get seats right on the aisle. So as the Bush family walked out of the cathedral, they walked right past him. And because W had owned the Rangers and he knew all the baseball people, he actually had stopped and visited them, said hi to them. And then we get on Air Force One to come back to Houston for the service in Houston and burial at College Station. So we're on our way back to Texas when who comes and finds me but the 43rd President of the United States? Jean, how did Albert Pujols get invited to Dad's funeral? I'm like, oh my God, I'm never gonna live this down. So I said, do you know? Yes, I know, the whole world knows that Dad was really mad at you. And now you've invited him to the, I said, I did not invite him. And I explained what happened. I don't think this really answers your question, but it's a funny story. I'm going to tell you all why Gorbachev told me to shut up. It is President Bush's 80th birthday, and he had agreed, with some reservation, because he hated asking friends for money. We used his 80th birthday as a fundraiser for MD Anderson, for the George Bush School of Government and Public Service, and for Points of Light. And we raised, I think, $56 million. It was hugely successful. and we were going to have it at the Hilton Americas in downtown Houston, but the RSVPs just kept coming in. We had to move it to Minute Maid Park, and thank heavens the Astros were on the road, and we could have it. Drayton McClain, then the owner of the Astros, let us put it at Minute Maid Park. I think 20,000 people came. So it was about 15 minutes before the show was to begin at 7. The President of the United States is there. The Vice President's there. President Bush was so touched, like 10 of his head of state friends came. He was so blown away by how many came. That would include Mikhail Gorbachev. So it's 10 minutes before showtime, and President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev are in the locker room of the Astros drinking vodka shots. Gorbachev had brought him a bottle of Russian vodka for a birthday present, and they decided to open it right there. And President Bush later told me that the Cold War ended over vodka shots. So the producer of the show is calling me saying, everybody needs to go to their seats. They were going to announce out President Bush, Laura Bush, Barbara Bush, but he says everybody else in that locker room needs to go to their seats. So I go to the most powerful man in the world. That would be the 43rd President of the United States of America. And I said, Mr. President, could you please ask your dad to quit drinking vodka with President Gorbachev because everyone needs to take their seats? And he looked at me and said, that's not my job. That's your job. You tell Dad to quit drinking vodka shots with Gorbachev. And I'm like, oh, great. So I go over and I say to President Bush, I said, sir, you keep in mind, this is a man who's always on time. The show's about ready to begin. We need to go here. And he totally got it. But Gorbachev asked his interpreter, a wonderful guy named Pavel, what I had said. And Pavel tells him, and I could tell that Gorbachev was irritated because he was sort of like, and I said to Pavel, what did he just say to you? And he started hem and hawed, and he said, he just asked me to tell you to shut up. I'm oddly proud of that. Any other questions? Does that mean this is the end? One over there? I think we're supposed to end at 7, so the timing's about right.
Hello. Any anecdote that comes to mind when you think of the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Say that.
Any anecdote that comes to mind when you think of the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, the fall of the Berlin Wall was before my time. I was in the East Wing, working for the First Lady of the United States. I can address that, but it would just be what I know from hearing President Bush talk about it and from what I've read. Our historian probably could even do it better. But what happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was a big deal when the wall came down. And there was a lot of frustration among the press and Republicans and even Democrats that President Bush took it so, You know, he literally, the press came into the Oval Office and they said, why aren't you jumping up and down? And he said, well, you know, it's good. I'm excited and it's good. It's good, but he was just so low-key. Actually, a Democratic congressman named Richard Gephardt, who was from Missouri, was furious that he didn't go to Berlin. He says, why aren't you dancing on the wall? Well, what we now know, and this is one of the reasons why President Bush was such a good president, we now know that they were terrified that Gorbachev was going to be overthrown and that the Soviets would march into East Germany and end this. And there absolutely was a movement afoot to do just that. So President Bush, Secretary Baker, they did not want to dance on the wall. They did not want to rub Gorbachev's face in this because they knew he was in trouble. And of course, they did try to overthrow him just a couple months later. And so they were downplaying it to keep everybody at bay, and it worked. And when things started getting declassified, all that became very obvious. I just read a book about Eisenhower, which was amazing, written by his granddaughter, Susan. And President Eisenhower was really good at doing the same thing. I'm too young to remember this. I think you're all too young to remember this, but you know from history that the Soviets had the first rocket that went into space. It had a monkey on it. And the United States and the world went nuts because everybody thought the Soviets were going to win the space race and be the first on the moon. And Eisenhower was just like, whatever. Well, he knew the truth. He knew exactly what was going on in our space industry. He knew we were going to win that race. But he didn't want to tip his hand to the Soviets. And and there's so many great examples like that of Eisenhower. He reminded me so much of President Bush. He didn't have to go out and brag about it or claim victory. He just very quietly. And I think, and Jeff, would you agree? I think history is being very kind to President Eisenhower. For a long time, he didn't get good reviews as president. But now, again, when all the truth is coming out, I think people are seeing that a lot of his very quiet, no comment, there was a good reason.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think I want to actually conclude with a thought on the night that the Berlin Wall fell, just in this regard, because it reinforces how important it is to support the work of history and support the work of uncovering the documents from history. A couple years ago, I guess it would have been about 2015 or so, we discovered in the library President Bush's handwritten notes from when he was on the phone the night that the Berlin Wall fell.
Oh, wow.
No, you're a part of the story.
I am?
Yes. But
I remember this.
Yes, they were handwritten notes, and I was very excited. So I found it in the archive, so I sent a copy to Jean and said, Jean, can you read this? And you said, no, I have no idea what this says.
His handwriting's horrible.
Yeah. So I said, okay. You said, well, let's say we got a couple of former secretaries of his. Let's send it to his former aides and see if they can read it. Send it to one aide, no idea what this says. Send it to another aide, no idea what this says. And let me tell you what it says, then I'll tell you how we know what it says. What it said, which
Had
was...
he already died?
No. But we didn't want to show him because we didn't want to say we couldn't read your handwriting.
Oh.
But what it said that was really interesting was, as he's talking about the Berlin Wall, which remember was in November of 1989, he kept writing over and over again, Tiananmen, 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 because he was really worried about a crackdown, that now that the Soviets have seen the wall fall, they might do what the Chinese had just done a few months earlier and send in the tanks. How did we discover this, you ask? What this gibberish said. I'm sitting in my office, and I'm staring at this, trying to figure this out, and my wonderful wife walks in. As many of you know, she works on 18th century documents, which are all handwritten, and I said, I can't figure out what this says. And Jean doesn't know what this says, and none of the secretaries know what it says. And as a person trained to read 18th century documents, she picked it up and immediately just read the whole thing right to us. So what I guess that means is early American history should still be studied.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
thank you all.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let me just quickly remind you that there are copies of the book available for you to pick up, and Jean would be happy to sign your copy, and I look forward to seeing you next semester.